Welcome to TaylorMade. I'm Bryce, and I like telling stories. I also like making things. Right now, what I'm making is a zine, where I'm taking an RPG adventure that I've been running and turning it into a 16 to 32 page booklet, something like that. I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to be because it's not done yet. If you want to know more about how to get this zine when it's done, I'll talk more about that later in the video. What I'm drawing here is a hobgoblin. This hobgoblin lives in a fancy house in a city called Tilnor, or if you could set it wherever you'd like in your world, if you're trying to fit this adventure into your own campaign or whatever. And his name is Captain Jekx. Jekx. He's the villain of the adventure. And in this adventure, the party will be doing a heist. So they're going to steal some stuff from Captain Jekx here. The zine is going to contain a bunch of information, everything you'll need to run this heist for this house. Among those things is going to be information about all the people that live in the house, including Jekx here. That'll include a portrait and things like where they're likely to be in the house and some stuff about their schedules. So depending on what time of day the party decides to heist this house, there'll be some information about where people will be, so it makes sense. It'll also have information about what each of those characters wants, sort of what motivates them. So that way, when you're running the adventure, and somebody asks them a question, you can be like, oh, that matches what, in my mind, is what they want, and what they're trying to accomplish or whatever. So your answers can feel good and motivated. You're not going to necessarily meet every character, so not everyone is going to have an incredibly in-depth, backstory. But Jekx here is pretty important. He's the owner of the house that they're heisting. So I guess I could say robbing, but heisting is more fun. And his desires and personality sort of comes through in more of the house and the rest of the occupants and why things are set up in the house in the way that they are. So he's pretty important for the heist. My players, when they're running, they haven't actually even seen him. Well, actually, that's not true. They saw him very briefly, but they are not. They haven't spoken to him or fought him or anything like that. That may not happen. It's very open to letting the players engage with this lived-in place as much as they possibly can. So I want to talk a little bit more about the setting. The land that this adventure is set in, very specifically this city, has been conquered by goblins and hobgoblins and things like that about 10 years ago. And the humans have now become accustomed to their rulers. They've become a lower class citizen. But the players in this world are forming a new resistance. And there's something in this house that they think will help resist the rule of these goblins that have taken over. So the general idea is that they will be out doing missions to gather people and weapons and steal things from the hobgoblins and try to do this covertly without being noticed too much, and have an effect on the rulers here. I want to talk a little bit more about the art. I've always considered myself more of a cartoonist, but I'm trying out different styles. In this one, my cartoonist self really wants to draw big dark lines around the outside of everything, and you could see earlier that I did that, and I've gone back and tried to eliminate them. You can see I just drew one on his shoulder, and I don't actually want that. I think I go back and sort of clean that up a little bit. Again, I am using Photoshop, and I'm mostly using this same brush that I was using in the cover illustration that I did in my last video. I'll put a link to that in the corner. You can see that. The brush I'm using is that same Kyle's Ultimate Pastel Palooza, which I still have no idea what its origin is. And I'm drawing using a Wacom 3 tablet. It's nice because you can use pressure to make the brush bigger or smaller. There's a couple of other things you can use the pressure sensitivity for. I'm pretty sure I'm just using it to make the brush in Photoshop bigger or smaller, which lets you have some neat control, and I like it. It feels pretty nice. It feels natural. Like if you push harder, it gets darker, which is good. You'll notice that I'm drawing in black and white, so the cover of the zine is going to be in color. The interior pages are going to be black and white. You can see I've come back over with light and not used the same dark outlines like I wanted to at first, and I fixed that shoulder, which is very nice. I'm glad I went back and did that. So, but I'm trying this different style where I draw the portraits and everything on the inside in black and white rather than drawing it in color and converting it to black and white later. I like that you get to really focus on the color values, and it's very much like painting with light, like figuring out where the light would go and not really thinking too much about the particular colors. But on the other hand, it might be better if I want to make tokens for putting this in a like virtual tabletop for people who like to play that way. It would be nice if those could be in color if people wanted them, or in black and white. So I'm considering going back and redrawing this and the other portraits in color and converting them to black and white. But so far, I think this has been a great exercise. It's also neat. I like the way that this brush adds texture. So some places are sort of more of a solid color, and then I can come in with this speckled light and dark, which I think looks kind of neat. I end up being quite happy with Jekx's face here, but I think I'd love to come back and rework the torso. What I did instead, and you can see I come back and redo how the torso is in a number of times throughout this drawing. What I end up doing is mostly just sort of disguise it behind the nameplate, which I'll get to in a minute. The scroll label, which is going to appear over him and give him a name. That I'll come back and I do in Illustrator, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk about Captain Jekx. Who is this person? Well, he is terrible. he's a jerk. He's a very terrible person. He gained honors amongst the hobgoblins after the invasion, mostly by rooting out resistances and any kind of human activity that is putting up a fight against the goblins. And he squashed them brutally. Humans know who he is, the goblins know who he is, just because of how vicious he was. He retired a few years ago, and he was given this house that it's set in and the staff. He was sort of forced to retire. One thing players might find out about him is that he retired because he was injured or sick. In my campaign, he has failing eyes, but I think I might actually make it so that you could pick from a couple different injuries that he may have been forced to retire because of, maybe like an injured leg or, bad back or something like that. I haven't figured out exactly what they would all be, but that way it would be different and tied more to your campaign. But one thing that's important is that he still wants to be helpful to the hobgoblins and goblins. So he wants to continue his work brutally putting down rebellions. You can see here I've jumped over to Illustrator to do the name here. And he consults with the hobgoblin leadership, so they are still interested. He's still good at his job. He's just not able to be quite so functional in in actually like command because of how he is injured. He still trains daily. One thing that's important about him is that he's become nocturnal again. In this setting, the hobgoblins and goblins are naturally nocturnal, but since they've invaded human lands, they sort of became more diurnal while they're in the active military. And since he's no longer in the active military, he's sort of slipped back into being his nocturnal self. And that affects how things happen in the house, which is some fact that the players can learn while they're scoping out the place. Once again, I'm using Illustrator here. I really like using vector art. There's a lot of cool things you can do with drawing these shapes. It's really cool to start with a square or a circle, and then you can add points to it. I did that a couple times and change the way that the handles come off of them. And so you can get all kinds of interesting shapes. And you can see I'm coming in here now with gradients to really make all of the curves of this thing pop. It's really what makes it look not just like a gray square and look like a piece of paper, which I think is pretty cool. Here I'm doing a circular gradient, which looks cool, to make it look like it's a rolled up tube of paper. And I'm pretty happy with the way that this has generally come out. I do a lot of subtle gradients in this where you'll see in a minute when I add like ripples in a couple of places. I'd love to still experiment with other parchment techniques, but I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. Also, I've used Illustrator a bunch and some other vector editing tools, but I definitely am sort of struggling a little bit here and there. You can notice me trying the same action over and over again a couple times, just because stuff doesn't work exactly the way I remember, and so I eventually got it to work the way I wanted, but I've cut out all of the Googling how to make sure I only round one of the corners, so you don't have to sit through me doing that. Here you can see I'm adding a bunch of points on the top and the bottom and just adding a sort of subtle wave up and down just to indicate that it's paper. And I've also gone in, you can see, and added a very slight gradient, and I've tried to match the gradient with the ripples so that it kind of looks realistic. And who doesn't want little notches in their old parchment? So I've come in here and done that. And I probably could have stopped there, but I spent a whole bunch of time adding these gradients, which you're about to see. Yeah, here we go. To make it look like the notches are peeling back and pulling towards the camera here. Which I think looks pretty neat. And then I zoomed out and it looks almost exactly as if they're just little notches. So I might use that technique again, but I think I'd really like to use it on a bigger notch in the future if I want to really make it stand out. And you can see I love watching it come together. While doing it, this little corner here, when bam, there it appeared. And now it looks like the paper has curled. It's so funny how just fiddling with that shape until you get it right, it can be deeply satisfying. And then adding gradients to this to make it look like it's curling is really nice. That paper sound, by the way, was totally accidental, but it was nice, so I'm leaving it in. Also, getting this gradient to line up like I'm doing right here was pretty tricky, and because really it wants to curve and have the gradient be different at the bottom than at the top. And I think ultimately what I decided on some of the other ones was to just make the shape that has that gradient be bigger. But I think it turned out pretty well in the end. Anyway, if Captain Jekx seems like an appealing villain and this campaign seems interesting to you and you like heists and things like that, I mentioned that I would let you know how to get this zine when it's done. Eventually, the plan is to release it for free, and if this is after I've done that, you'll find a link to it down in the description. Right now, at the time of the release of this video, I'm actually running a Kickstarter for mostly so I can print the zines so people can get a physical printed copy of it if they want. But if you want to get the PDF early and to support the project, then you could go to the Kickstarter, which I'm linking down in the description below. And if you really want to play this and maybe somebody else is running the game for you, you could point them towards it and say, hey, this sounds neat, and you can point them towards the video and the Kickstarter, and that would be super helpful. And for more updates on the zine, you can subscribe to this channel, and I'll release more videos. And that just about does it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you later. Bye.